Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. Today we're going to begin a series on the psychology of Kundalini Yoga and the psychological meaning of each of the chakras. And this is drawing a lot on Carl Jung's series of lectures on the topic back in 1932, but I want to interlace it with other bits of psychology and mythology, as well as mapping it over onto different developmental systems like spiral dynamics and Maslow and others. Today we're going to be looking at the Root Chakra, the Muladhara chakra, and looking at a bit of the symbolism, a bit of the objects attached to that, and what the psychology of that is. So let's jump right in. So the Muladhara chakra is the base chakra. It's the root chakra located in the perineum at the base of the body's trunk. And Muladhara just means root support in Sanskrit. And you'll notice in the iconography and the symbolism of this image, it's usually drawn either with a snake that's coiled up and also sometimes with a brown elephant, which is what Jung explores in his lecture on Muladhara. And this snake that's coiled up, that is the Kundalini. So Kundalini is this snake that sleeps in the root chakra, and as we rise through the development of the chakras, it climbs up through the chakra system and unites with another energy in the ajna, in the third eye chakra, and together they form this cosmic non-dual kind of consciousness. And the Kundalini snake is associated with Shakti, the feminine goddess. So it's this feminine goddess sleeping deep in us in the root chakra. And that with that awakened, the path to higher consciousness begins, because that's something that's really interesting about the Kundalini system, is that it's about higher consciousness. Everything that we know, everything in this materialist world is all contained in that root chakra, and that's something that I found particularly fascinating with this analysis of Muladhara. And the journey up through the chakras is one of higher development, and we're looking at the higher levels of consciousness and spiritual development. So really this is the future of humanity in terms of consciousness, and that obviously promises to be quite fascinating. And the element associated with Muladhara is earth, and that's for obvious reasons, as we'll see, because the whole thing about Muladhara, as I said, is that it's this reality, it's the physical material reality. Everything about our modern world is stuck in Muladhara. If anything, it has cut off any ties to anything higher. And we've grounded ourselves more and more in this earthiness, in this rootedness in a material world. And you can think of the higher levels as you're rising up. So the Svadhisthana is the water and Manipura is fire. So you're getting the elements get more and more rarefied up to air and ether and beyond that. So it's the rarefication, but we live very much in the roots, very much on the earth. And we take this to be the fundamental reality. So if you want to think of what is the earthiness of Muladhara, well, it's making appointments, it's going to the toilet, it's feeding yourself, it's the really basic things, it's going to the supermarket and buying your food, it's getting a ticket on the bus, it's the world of appointments and diaries and reminders, and that is the grounded earthiness of Muladhara. And it's something that's really important, and it's something you can't lose touch with, and we are always as egos in Muladhara. So what happens with the higher levels of consciousness is that the self, the deeper aspect of us, gets woken up, the higher self, the Jungian self, but the ego is always that thing of Muladhara. It's always grounded in this physical material reality, but to realize that this is not all that we are, to realize that there is a connection to something greater, and that inner journey kind of happens. And so that's what the whole process of Kundalini is. It's the awakening of that inner world, the awakening of the higher realities, the higher planes of consciousness. And that's just that's a really fascinating thought when you think about it, that all of our reality is in this base chakra. Like I think when I first started investigating the chakras as a personality system, I would have always thought that we were higher up, that we were at another level. But to think that we are just at the bottom, in some sense it's humbling, but in another sense it's very exciting. Another core point that kind of tags onto this is the opposite representation in East versus West, and this ties in with Jung's point about how these Eastern doctrines can potentially be poisonous to the Western mind if we don't do work to integrate them psychologically. Explored that in an earlier episode, but one of the contexts of that is this opposite representation. So you'll notice that the earth element is down at the bottom there, and the element above is water. which is the water monster. That's the night sea journey, and then you rise into fire. Whereas in the West, very much our representation is that to go into the unconscious is to go down. That we identify with our consciousness as being up in the head, and we think about going down into the body, going down into the lower instincts. And you go into the water of emotionality, and you go through the fires of passion, you rise into the air of wisdom. And I guess the Western map over would be, you think about Dante's Inferno, Dante's Divine Comedy. So Dante starts off, he's comes out of a forest in the middle of his life, and this dark forest is representative. It's an alternate image of the water, I guess you'd say, as a representation of the unconscious. But he comes out of that and he goes into the fires of hell, and it's the descent then. And you see that he descends down all the different layers of hell, all these different layers of fire, and then he climbs down the leg of the devil, and through that rises up on the opposite side of the world into purgatory and up into the higher spheres, into the planetary spheres of heaven. And I guess that's you could think of that as the Western journey, that it's a descent that becomes an ascent. And maybe we haven't integrated that wisdom of Dante as much in the mainstream representation of the transformative journey, that it's a going down, it's a going under, but through that going down and going under there is a rise, there is an escalation of consciousness eventually. But it's interesting to see that in this Eastern representation, the water, rather than being above us, it's like Jesus being baptized in the waters above rather than below. It's like the consciousness goes upwards, whereas we've got the night sea journey going down. So that's obviously an interesting inversion, a different way of looking at it that is quite fruitful. But yeah, so Muladhara is the realm of earth. It's the realm of being rooted into the earth, being rooted into these things of politics and talking to people about the weather and just really earthy, grounded kind of stuff. And as Jung says, at this phase the gods are asleep. The sense that there's a higher reality, the sense that there's anything spiritual is kind of dormant. And you see this being challenged in the different traditions. Even Stoicism has this antagonism towards the world, this antagonism towards the getting caught up in worldly affairs and putting undue esteem on them. And that can seem like such an ascetic kind of thing when you look at it just as Stoicism, just living according to virtue. Virtue is the totality of eudaimonia, it's the totality of happiness. So being good is sufficient to be happy. And that can seem so bare when it seems like negative, when it seems like no saying. But it's saying no to the outer world. But then if you look at this Jungian psychology, you look at this Eastern psychology, you see that in saying no to that outer world and withdrawing that life energy from the outer world, it awakens an inner world, and the dreams become activated and everything inside begins to transform, and you get that alchemical process. And I guess to tie it in with the three colours of masculinity and the three colours of femininity that we explored in previous weeks, when the night becomes black, when the woman reaches the black stage, so this is the third stage of each's development, you can see that blackness as a withdrawing of light from the world and the turning of that light inwards. And so it can seem like the stoic has become black to the world. It seems like they've just withdrawn their colour, but what you don't see is that for every black hole there is a white hole, and where the blackness reflects the lack of colour, the lack of giving out of colour, then that colour has gone, that light has gone somewhere else, and that's into the inner world, and we see the levels of consciousness rising. And I think that that's the appropriate way to look at it, is that the black night it's an inflection point. When you've reached the colour black, it's the beginning of the onward journey. It's the beginning of that alchemy. So alchemy, you can see, is the work of coming into your own, moving through the higher levels of colours, moving through these chakras. So that reaching that midlife transition point, reaching that level of the black night, is actually just reaching the end of Muladhara. It's reaching the point where that has come to its end, and it's to begin to rise up the other levels. And to tie this over onto Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you could say everything up to self-actualization, all the lower levels are Muladhara. It's like you need to build the foundation of all those other needs, and you need to meet all those other needs before you can focus on self-actualization, before you can focus on moving up into the higher levels of consciousness. So we need to meet the demands of the earthly. We need to conquer what is going on in terms of earthly consciousness, in terms of these earthly demands, before we can move up. So you satisfy those lower drives, and that acts as a foundation. And once you've sorted all your worldly affairs, then Kundalini will awaken. Then that snake will awaken and begin her climb. The only way around that, I guess, is to turn your back on it. And that is what you can see the Buddha and the ascetics in ancient India, or even the monks in the Western tradition, that's what they do, is they turn their back on these lower drives on these lower worldly affairs, and they just say, I'm not going to become wealthy, I'm not going to become a family member or become a member of the community, I am going to dedicate myself to this inner world. And so they cut off those things in order that they can begin that development sooner. The trouble, I guess, is when you have one foot in each plane and you're trying to do both, you're trying to balance both, so you don't throw your bag over the wall. But I think this consciousness of the higher levels of development is something that's implicit in us. We know that this life is not sufficient unto itself. We know that there's more to it, and in some sense we can get caught in going through the motions, and we can get stuck in Muladhara because it's all we know. But there's much more to it, and there's something in the awareness of death which seems to trigger that. And that was something in Stoicism. The memento mori was an attempt to become aware of that, to realize that. And there's a great quote in Henry David Thoreau that's worth quoting, because it really taps into this essence of Muladhara and how we get caught in Muladhara when there's so much beyond it and so much more for us to explore. When a man is warmed by the several modes which I have described, what does he want next? Surely not more warmth of the same kind as more and richer food, larger and more splendid houses, finer and more abundant clothing, more numerous, incessant and hotter fires, and the like. When he has obtained those things which are necessary to life, there is another alternative than to obtain the superfluities, and that is to adventure on life now, his vacation from humbler toil having commenced. The soil, it appears, is suited to the seed, for it has sent its radicle downwards, and it may now send its shoot upward also with confidence. Why has man rooted himself thus firmly in the earth, but that he may rise in the same proportion into the heavens above? For the nobler plants are valued for the fruit they bear at last, in the air and light, far from the ground. I do not mean to prescribe rules to strong and valiant natures, who will mind their own affairs whether in heaven or hell, but mainly to the mass of men who are discontented, and idly complaining of the hardness of their lot or of their times, when they might improve them. I also have in mind that seemingly wealthy, but most terribly impoverished class of all, who have accumulated dross, but know not how to use it, or get rid of it, and thus have forged their own golden or silver fetters. And that's a beautiful image in Thoreau that's kind of spontaneously maps over onto this idea of Muladhara, that we've focused on the roots, we've built the roots, but what man is made for is for those fruits, for the flowers we throw up at the peak of our development, not for focusing on how intricate and deep our roots are. So once we have these earthly needs met, it's time to rise. It's time to rise up through the levels of higher consciousness. It's why do you need a bigger house? Why do you need a faster car? Once you have these fundamental needs met, it's time to rise to the higher levels. It's time to go deeper into yourself. It's time to unfold that inner blueprint, that inner potentiality of what humans can be. And that really puts everything in perspective. It puts all this worry about politics, this worry about the stock markets, this worry about what other people think, about how we look, about these things that are just surface deep. And you know that when someone comes face to face with death, that it transforms that perspective. They realize that there was so much more to life. There were so many other things that they could have experienced. And in some sense, we waste our lives perhaps because our culture is not giving us it's not feeding that imagination for the greater potentialities. Perhaps because we've gotten so deep into Muladhara that we can no longer conceive of the greater potentials of humanity, that we now believe in a materialist universe. We believe that this is all there is. And so in many ways that bars off the levels to higher development. This is in some sense the triumph and the doom of high civilization. We've come so far. Our science and our technology is built on our focus and this prepossession on Muladhara, and I do believe that it's positive. I do believe that we've built this solid foundation in order that we can go higher. And it gives an alternate perspective on what the future development of humanity will look like if we see it not just in terms of materialness, but if we see that those material, that's a base that we needed to build. We needed to build a solid foundation so that more people could rise, so that it's not just the odd monk, the odd ascetic that can go off and pursue this higher level of consciousness, but that the entirety of humanity can move to higher levels of consciousness. And so the purpose of all this high civilization is perhaps to meet that basic need, so that the gods can awaken, so that Kundalini can awaken, and we can rise up and we can meet the challenges of higher development. So that's just about everything that I wanted to cover on Muladhara. I think it's just this fascinating idea that we are grounded in it, we are stuck in the roots, but that this isn't all that we are. As Thoreau says, these roots, these things of bigger, these playthings of modernity are just in some sense distractions. We've met the needs of our roots, And now it's important to remember that there's more we can go for, there's more beyond us. And so it's an invitation to these higher levels of consciousness, an invitation to more, in the same way that spiral dynamics would be that sort of an invitation. Is to see that there are further steps of development we can take. In the next episode, we'll be looking at Svadhisthana, which is the sacral chakra, and it's the next one above, and that's entering into the water, that's entering into the unconscious. And so that's what we'll be exploring next in the chain of Kundalini development. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have, please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'd love to hear from you down in the comments if you have any thoughts, insight or feedback. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.